Welcome to my presentation on designing a course integrating critical pedagogy, literature, and religious studies. My name is Jim Dooley, and I will be your tour guide for the next 10 to 15 minutes. A few words of background about myself. I teach religious studies at a university in the Washington, D.C. area. I teach comparative world religions and religion and literature. My literature courses are cross-listed in both the religious studies and the English departments. My objectives today are first to provide a review of the topic. We're going to be considering the concepts of religion and religious studies. I'm going to introduce the theory of critical pedagogy, and I'm going to be defending its applicability to the teaching of religion and literature. Then we will consider how a few scholars have proposed the development of course curricula using a specific type of literature. And finally, I'll convey a sense of some of the pedagogical implications of the topic. Now, everyone probably has his or her own sense of what religion means. But when we look at the varieties of religious experience, as Harvard philosopher William James called them, we find it hard to come up with a precise working definition. Here are a few attempts by noted religious studies scholars of the 20th century. Paul Tillich, a German theologian, coined the phrase religion as one's ultimate concern. He stated that religion, in the largest and most basic sense of the word, is ultimate concern. Religion is not a special function of man's spiritual life, but the dimension of depth in all its functions. Jonathan Z. Smith, University of Chicago, is probably one of the most famous late 20th century religious studies scholars. He argued that religion is a tradition that has achieved sufficient power and numbers to enter our history, to form it, interact with it, or thwart it. And Houston Smith, whose name is almost synonymous with scholar of comparative religions, gave his personal view that religion is, for me, the search for the real and the effort to approximate one's life to it. Now, although university religious studies programs are relatively recent developments, the study of religions and the ways that they are practiced has fascinated students in all walks of life for as far back as you might care to look. People who are interested in people tend also to be interested in how they think and in what ways they express their beliefs. Religion, society, and culture are closely intertwined. And in a real way, religions exist to help their societies answer what scholar Wesley Wildman calls the big questions, those dealing with metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, along with a few others, insofar as they possess religious significance. Now, Wildman acknowledges that the idea of religious significance is difficult to pin down because the interests of religious groups and individuals vary dramatically across cultures and contexts and eras. But if you and I are less interested in the philosophies of religion than we are in how different religions are believed and practiced, the big questions can reasonably be reduced to what I call the central questions. Where do we come from? Why are we here? And where are we going? Of course, there are many other contender questions. Why is there evil, for instance? Or do humans need to be saved? And so on. It almost goes without saying that different religions approach those questions differently and come up with different interpretations of answers. So, why teach religion? J.Z. Smith states that the aim of an undergraduate program of studies in religion should be the understanding of religion as one of our primary responses to and expressions of the human condition, establishing our existence by expressing the truth of what it is to be human. Let's now consider critical pedagogy. Sabrina Billings, pictured here, Dartmouth University, defines it as an educational theory based on the idea that schools typically serve the interests of those who have power in society by, usually unintentionally, perpetuating unquestioned norms for relationships, expectations, and behaviors. Now, those of you who are familiar with Paulo Freire's theories in Pedagogy of the Oppressed are right to recognize the connection. This is important in the art of teaching religions, that it would be all too easy for us to privilege one religion, usually our own, over another. We must work not to perpetuate a sense that one religion may be considered preferential over another. We cannot use a scorecard or a list of what we think is correct and then to see whether or not the other religion is as correct as ours. Faith and adherents of different faiths should not be stigmatized. Now, writing in the 1960s, Van Harvey noticed that the study of religions makes it an object of suspicion in the minds of humanistic scholars and of administrators in state universities, namely, that the definition of the field, its curriculum, and to a great extent its content are definitely shaped by a Protestant Christian bias. Similarly, Darrell Hart of Hillsdale College agreed that instruction in religion, despite its affinities with literature, philosophy, history, and general education, could not shake off its specifically Protestant orientation. The barriers to objectivity are many because we are humans. So we need to adopt techniques that can help us be even more effective than we might be at the moment. Professors in my department who teach religion and literature tend to have their own favorite ways of approaching the topic. I use modern novels to help identify religious themes. As we read novels by Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, and Mormon scholars, we see realistic depictions of how people within the religion respond to different situations. We learn about the religion by watching people, not by studying doctrinal statements. Using literature as part of the religious studies curricula allows both instructors and students to hear authors who speak from within their own traditions, in addition to those who are outside of the tradition. Now, here are some of the thoughts of a few best-selling contemporary authors about how they might be considered religious writers. Allegra Goodman, a Jewish author, states that Jewish literature means different things to different people. It can mean writing by a Jewish author, writing about Jewish culture, writing about Jews, or writing about Judaism as a religion. I don't always write about Jewish people, but I am always a Jewish author. And Orson Scott Card, a multi-genre Mormon author, states that I learned that I didn't have to think about putting in Mormon stuff to write Mormon fiction. Anything I write was going to be Mormon fiction. Andrew Thrasher and Austin Freeman are editors of the book Theology, Fantasy, and the Imagination. They argue that fantasy literature is an appropriate genre to be taught as part of religion and literature. They state that theology is the study of reality. Particularly, it concerns itself with that reality which both transcends and underlies the reality that we experience with our senses. Fantasy, on the other hand, is a form of make-believe. They also seem to agree, or they do agree, that fantasy is a form of make-believe, and that reality and fantasy are mutually opposed to one another. They ask, is this not an insult to religion to associate it with fantasy? Well, their answer is no, it is not an insult. And the dozen or so authors included in the book don't think so either. Thrasher and Freeman study George MacDonald and even J.R.R. Tolkien and argue that fantasy authors are essentially makers who create a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates or what she relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it while you are, as it were, inside. Nathan Fredrickson, in his 2016 article on designing a course using fantasy literature, argues that since the genre often contains fictional races, such as dwarves and orcs, who have essentialized moral and intellectual properties linked to bodily traits, fantasy literature provides a useful, relatively detached space for critical thought regarding the representation of marginalized and stigmatized people. Such fiction allows one to approach the perspective of the other, both in safety and yet with vulnerability. Fredrickson has proposed a course model for the teaching of fantasy literature within the scope of religious studies. One of the primary objectives of this course is, he says, conscientization, which is to say, both critical consciousness and conscientiousness raising. The students and the teacher should be transformed, and this should include transformed, enlarged behavior, not merely some new vocabulary words or memorized facts. This is what he calls an intervention in society. Fredrickson has designed 8 modules that are intended to link together, but any of them could be used in isolation, or they could all be taught as part of a 2-semester undergraduate class. Now here's a quick look at some of the pedagogical suggestions Fredrickson poses in his first module, Defining Key Terms. Since there are terms that are problematic, engage the class in figuring out how to use them. Fredrickson explains how his study modules can be made appropriate for high school students, undergraduate students, or graduate students. And he gives suggested readings for each level. Some are pretty light, high schoolers, and some are pretty heavy, us. In my investigation, I discovered Josh Herring's article, The Hero as God, an exploration of Mormon soteriology in the fantasy novels of Orson Scott Card and Brandon Sanderson. I have used Card's sequel to Ender's Game, the space travel novel Speaker for the Dead, as the capstone novel of my own religion and literature classes for several years. As I said earlier, my students read books by Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Mormon, and even pre-biblical authors. As we dive into Speaker for the Dead, my students examine the overt representations of Catholicism, the Reformed Church, Calvinism, Lutheranism, and the more subtle representations of Judaism and Mormonism. They also debate the religiosity of Card's 2 made-up religions, one of which is the religion of the Piggies. Piggies, a newly discovered alien sentient species. The Piggies. The Piggies are examples of Fredrickson's fictional races who have essentialized moral and intellectual properties. This is the novel where all of the religious themes that we have seen in the other novels are seen in toto. Concerns about death and dying, the struggles for redemption, families and isolation, religious tolerance and intolerance, how to live one's life when time essentially has no meaning, and so much, as well as the efforts to understand the Piggies by understanding what seems to be their religion, which is very unlike human religions, and the typical elements of religion are hard to find. I am pleased to discover that I have already been using the basic concepts of critical pedagogy as I have worked to overcome the barriers to objectivity that I anticipate from my students. But one of the insights that I have gained from this presentation is the way that the Piggies are able to substitute for the other to allow our examination of their religion from a safe space. The pedagogical implications inherent in this study are that critical pedagogy, if rightly practiced, can increase our awareness of possible stereotypes that work to stigmatize different faiths and their adherents. Religious themes can be found in texts that are not strictly theological. Works of fiction, especially fantasy literature, allow the reader to consider a surrogate other from a safer place. Religious behaviors can be studied, and learning can be enhanced without self-imposed barriers to objectivity. And there is enhanced flexibility in curriculum design. Religious themes can be found in many genres and works. Now here are my references, and I know that they're pretty small here. I'm going to make the entire list available as part of the discussion post. So, I look forward to fielding your own comments, questions, and thoughts. I expect to learn from your insights, and I hope that you have been able to learn from some of mine.